Shalom, everyone. We're gathered today on the 7th of December, 2024 on the Gregorian calendar, which happens to line up with the 21st of the 8th month, if I remember correctly, on our Creator's calendar. I might be off by a week, and if I am, please forgive me. But we've finished with our study of the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. We also covered last week with the last testament of Benjamin, the testament of Kohath, and the visions of Amram, which happened to be the son of Louis and then the son of Kohath, respectively. Amram being the father of Miriam, Aharon, and Moshe. So, because they were given the kahuna and the writings of the patriarchs were passed to them, as we'd seen, they also had the responsibility of being a light to the people, to being a guide to them in these times. And as Moshe was trying to say, don't you know that I was raised up as a deliverer? You don't really get the context of that until you go back to his father foretelling that thing in his visions that we had just read, the fragments that we still have now that were discovered amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. But either way, right here is the book of Exodus. We're going to be going back and forth between the Septuagint version here, and there's a comparison of the KJV for anyone that wants to look at it. Sometimes this one will have different information or a little bit more information than what you'll see on the other side. The Septuagint came down from the Greek version that was translated during the time of Ptolemy Soter, I believe he's called, or Ptolemy Philopator. I'm not exactly sure on which one. There was many Ptolemies. It was a title for the pharaohs after the Greeks came to power there, just like Pharaoh is a title, or Melech is a title. Actually, Mashiach was a title for the king, a Melech in the land there, right? Either way, they had a different translation, and sometimes there's different information from the Greek version to the Masoretic, which is what the KJV was translated from for most of its translation. Sometimes they would take the translation from the Septuagint because the Masoretic blatantly changed what was in the renewed covenant. The quotes are different, so they would correct it to this one, even though they didn't use it for everything else. But either way, if you can't read this with me, let me know and I can zoom in. I can make it larger, okay? If you want, we could just read it that way. Otherwise, I'll keep the text open for both and you can see the differences for yourself. So just let me know as you need it, okay? Either way, this is chapter 1. And then as we go through, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to skip between this and then a PDF that was put together by a brother that shows the additions or the things that are missing from the Masoretic text that you can find in both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the versions of these texts from there. For anyone that's not familiar, the Samaritan Pentateuch was a copy that was made by the Samaritans after they had their own temple on Mount Gerizim and they were keeping their own law. That version of the law is still kept in a type of Paleo-Hebrew to this day. And it's only the first 5 books, if I remember. They don't keep too much of the other writings. And aside from that, the major difference is there's no mention of Yerushalayim or Zion as the place for their Hekel or temple. That was squashed because of what they had done. If you want information on that, it's in Josephus's writings and the books of the Maccabees for more information there, right? But the fact that they were having contentions can even be seen in the Masoretic text or in the renewed covenant times when the woman at the well is talking with our Mashiach about which place is the true place of worship. So we'll get back to this one when we get to it, but I just wanted to show you real quick. This was written by a friend or a believer, and he went through, I don't know if it's exhaustive or not, but he goes through and shows different places, both in Genesis, the book of Exodus, and the book of Numbers, I believe, where there's just missing text from the Masoretic, like what you see here, but it's actually in the Samaritan versions and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What the scholars, modern scholars, will do is they'll take these fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they'll see that it's there, and they'll say, oh, well, they added that to try to fill in gaps for their broken texts. And this is the contention that the author of this PDF had, that the scholars are wrong and that it was the original, which I happen to agree with there. Whether the scholars are intentionally deceptive or just wrong on because that's what they've been taught, we can't know the heart of anyone, but we can keep in mind that it was the lying pens of the scribes that were foretold in the scriptures. It's mentioned in Deuteronomy that our enemies will try to deceive us, and we will walk or tread upon their high places, keeping their feasts and festivals. It mentions in Hosea and is expounded on in the interpretations of that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Uh, and these things are actually what's happened. We have all the history behind that, and the fact that those enemies have intentionally infiltrated places of education and theology to have people in positions of authority to discredit the truth makes this all possible. But that's a little behind the scenes stuff that there's a lot more than we need to get into right now. The point here is that we're going to be able to see, like we've been mentioning for a while, that sometimes you'll have longer areas of text that aren't actually in the Masoretic, but it was originally there. And once you have it in there, the things that have happened otherwise make sense. There's stories in scripture, there's narratives of things that go on where if you pay attention, the context is missing. And that's what some of this is covering. But we'll get to that as we come to it. You can see the first example for the book of Exodus here. I believe they mentioned right here is in chapter 6, so we won't have to worry about that for a while. But in the meantime, this is chapter 1, and you'll see one of the discrepancies very shortly in the amount of people that were here going into the land. This one says 70, this one says 75, and when you look at the other writings, the book of Yobelim and the testaments of the 12 patriarchs and things that were going on, Dan had 4 children that died, and Dinah passed away before they went in, so they would have had 70 instead of 75. While this one gives you the full number of the people that were born to him, right? This one gives you how many actually went into the land or were counted as going into the land. Dan's children went in, but 4 of them, most of them passed away after entering, and they were all counted amongst the Gentiles, is what it said. Just like the 2 sons of Yahudah that died before going into Mitzrayim. But we'll go ahead and continue here. It says, this is chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Yisrael that came into Mitzrayim, or Egypt, together with Jacob their father. They came in each with their whole family. Mizraim or Mitzrayim is the name of Ham's son, who it was originally named after, both because that was his name, and his name foretells or protends the encloser or the confiner of the waters, which is what he did by shoring up the Nile and allowing it to be a river instead of flooding the whole plain. But that's found in Alexander Hislop's Two Babylons. It was later named Egypt after Egyptus, which was a Greek name for one of the sons of Yahudah that left after they were contending for who's going to be ruling over the area, right? You can read more about that stuff in Egyptian histories and other things where they talk about the Exodus beforehand. We've gone over those before. I just wanted to mention the reason why there's 2 names there. So going on, it says Reuben, Shimon, Louis, Yahudah, Yishakar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. But Yahusuf was in Mitzrayim, and all the souls or inner beings of Jacob were 75. And Yahusuf died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And we know that that was about 91 years. All the generation was gone about 91 years after they entered the land. That was when the war happened that closed off the borders there. It says, and the children of Yisrael, or Israel, increased and multiplied and became numerous, and it grew exceedingly strong. And the land multiplied them. And there arose up another king over Mitzrayim, who knew not Yahusuf. And we'll read in the book of Yobelim that this king was the Canaanite who conquered or beat the Egyptians in that battle and then closed off the borders. It was at his instigation that the Egyptians, who were benefactors and received the benefit of the children and Yahusuf beforehand, would turn and take those who they called friends and enslave them. But we've talked about that before. If you remember, because they broke their vow, the sons of Canaan were given up to be the peculiar people for Satan in the world, his agents to do what they would. And they stayed in that land that was above all lands to pervert it and doing all manner of evil, as it's mentioned in the wisdom of Solomon, or Hokmah Shalomo. And then he wants to pervert the seed. He wants to stop the promises. He wants to make all the things of no effect. So he's doing all these things through men to accomplish that. Stopping the border, blocking them from going in, and then imprisoning and enslaving them is an objective to do such a thing. And then also with the killing of the firstborn, as we'll read. But if you keep that in mind, that it's the principalities and powers beyond what you're seeing men, what we see in the men here. Those are the real actors that we have to be mindful of, just like scripture tells us in the renewed covenant, where he's making these things plainly known. He says, and he said to his nation, behold, the race of the children of Israel is a great multitude and is stronger than we. Come then, and let us deal craftily with them, lest at any time they be increased. And whensoever war shall happen to us, these also shall be added to our enemies. And having prevailed against us in war, they will depart out of the land. So you see, his goal was to stop them from departing. And he set over them taskmasters who should afflict them in their works. And they built strong cities for Pharaoh, both Pitho and Ramses, and On, which is Heliopolis. And if you remember, or you might not be familiar, Ramses here is an acronym, I think they call it. It's a later name that was put in the text. This was originally used as a way of trying to discredit the scriptures or to make it seem like Moshe didn't really write this and it's not legitimate. But for anyone that might not have this firm in their minds, all of the scriptures were destroyed or burned when Nebuchadnezzar came in at the time of the Babylonian captivity. When they returned to the land, they didn't have the writings anymore. And it was at Ezra's instigation, his prayer, that he was endowed with the Ruach, and there was 5 scribes that would write down what he was dictating for 40 days and nights. And they rewrote all of the scriptures. When they wrote them, they would have written them in a way that the people could have comprehended. And all of the earliest scriptures that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls date to shortly after Ezra's time, because that's when they would have been given to us again. So when you have things that have an acronyms, or it talks about how Moshe died and he obviously wasn't the one writing, that's why. And it shouldn't be something that discourages or gives it illegitimacy, but helps to affirm the facts of what is actually written. It proves forth Ezra. It proves other things. And there's other evidences in Fourth Ezra that talk about the migrations of the Northern Kingdom and stuff that's going on that's very relevant for our history and for continuity's sake. So we know it cause and effect. Excuse me. But this was originally what they call a varis, or that's the same word for a Hebrew. The word over in English, right? Eber, Hebrew, Iberia, these are all Avery. These are all the same. It sounds different. There's different vowel sounds to it. It's fluctuated as people have changed where they go. This isn't a phenomenon that should surprise anyone, most especially an English-speaking people in America, where you can't go from one city to another without having a different accent or dialect or the way the words sound funny to you. It's just a phenomenon that happens. It's explained a little bit in his word why that happens as well. If you want one that is directly related to our country, Psalm 54 in the Septuagint or Psalm 55, it talks about why the tongues would be divided. And it mentions a list of things that will happen for people who are doing such stuff. It also mentions the dove in the wilderness, which is directly related to America. So that's why I mentioned that. But all these things are tied together, okay? And it's as we learn that we can reason through them, that we can make reasonably right decisions in everything that we do. So hopefully that makes sense. But this Ramses was originally a Varus, and that is one of the cities that was being excavated. And it's known that there were Semitic people that were there, and it was part of these times. But because scholars shift the timelines, they don't acknowledge it as legitimately showing what was in scripture. The patterns of evidence videos that have recently came out go into detail about that. I highly recommend everyone watch those as well as Ron Wyatt stuff. It's amazing for confirming the truth of his word, right? But I'll leave it there. It says, but as they humbled them, so by so much they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, and the Mitzraites or Egyptians greatly abhorred the children of Yisrael. And the Mitzraites or Egyptians tyrannized over the children of Israel by force, and they embittered their life by hard labors in the clay and in brick making, and all the works in the plains according to all the works, wherein they caused them to serve with violence. Now, it says all the works in the plains. I don't know if it mentions anything outside of that, but we also have the facts that they were in the turquoise mines that the Egyptians have because they have the pictograph Hebrew, and they have some writings from those times uh, still today that you can see. And the turquoise mines are not in the plains, they're in the mountain hilly area of the Sinai Peninsula, which is why I mentioned, I don't know if it mentions that here, but they might have been doing that of their own volition before they were enslaved, for all I know. It says, and the king of the Mitzraites spoke to the midwives of the Hebrews. The name of the one was Zipporah or Sephora, and the name of the second, Phua. And I don't remember if the second one is mentioned by name, but this Sephora is in Egyptian writings that they still have, along with the the Papyrus of Ipuwa or something like that, which is an account of the plagues that happened to them. They also have some list of Hebrew names, and the midwife here is all amongst them. That information is also in the patterns of evidence videos. It says, and he said, when you do the office of midwife to the Hebrew women, and they are about to be delivered, if it be a male, kill it, but if a female, save it. But the midwives feared Elohim and did not as the king of Mitzrayim appointed them, and they saved the male children alive. And the king of the Mitzrayim called the midwives and said to them, why is it that you have done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, And the midwives said to Pharaoh,
Said,
uh, I'm sorry, just a moment. So, and it says, the Pharaoh had said, "Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women are not as the women of Mitzrayim, for they are delivered before the midwives go into them. So they bore children. And Elohim did well to the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And as the midwives feared Elohim, they established for themselves families. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Whatever male child shall be born to the Hebrews, cast into the river, and every female, save it alive." And it doesn't mention the details in here, but that went on for 7 months. You find that in particular in the book of Yobelim. It was during that time that Moshe was born and kept alive for, as you can see here, if it translates, no, it doesn't. It says months right here, and it says months over here. But yeah, if you can see the Hebrew word there, it says Yod Resh Chet, and that would be Yarok, or the word for Jericho is very similar, but it's the moons. That is not the same word for a month that is used throughout the entirety of Scripture, which is Chodesh. It's an exception to the fact. And that's because at this time, when they were in captivity to the Egyptians, they weren't keeping the calendar correctly. They didn't have the information or the ability to. This could have been, um, well, she specifically kept him for 3 moons before having him go in the river. And that was, it's hidden whenever you say month there. So I just wanted to point that out. You can see it right here in the Hebrew for the KJV. You can go ahead and check that out. No, there you can see it there, Yarok. But it means moon, not month. It says, and there was a certain man of the tribe of Louis who took a wife, one of the daughters of Louis. And this is literally Amram, who's Louis's grandson, who took the daughter of Louis, literally his aunt Jochebed, as wife. And we've already covered that in the testaments and things that we've read. At this time, um, it's also something to keep in mind that his it was not considered a sin for them to do that because the Torah had not been given that prohibited it. This was a common practice from antiquity that you can read Noah doing with his children, his sons and daughters, giving them to his brother's children, the cousins, right? Abraham married his own half sister. So these are not phenomenon that were prohibited at that time. And it was actually enjoined for him to do so, to marry within the family. And then his children were doing it too as a type and picture, but that's a different thing. That just goes along with what scripture says by Shaul that where there is no Torah, there is no sin. Once the Torah came, then the sin renewed and you died. That's the whole point. For anyone who doesn't know better and they're doing it, once they know the truth and they stop, it's completely attributed to the ignorance that they had done it and it's not accounted to them. That's exactly what Kefa teaches in the recognitions, and Ob willing, or Father willing, you can see how that is playing out in reality here as well. But it says, and she conceived and bore a male child, and having seen that he was fair, they hid him 3 months, or moons, as we just mentioned. And when they could no longer hide him, his mother took him, or for him, an ark, and besmeared it with bitumen, and cast the child into it, and put it in the ooze by the river. This is reminiscent of being delivered from the ark, just like Noah was a type of that. I never actually thought about it that way before, but the same besmearing it with pitch. is mentioned here. It says, and his sister was watching from a distance to learn what would happen to him. Remember, she was about 10 years old when Aharon was born, and Aharon was 3 years older than Moshe. At least that's what I believe we had gotten the ages from the differences in the Testament or the visions of Amram there, where it talks about that a little bit. This is, and his sister was watching from a distance to learn what would happen to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the river to bathe, and her maids walked by the river's side. And having seen the ark in the ooze, she sent her maid and took it up. And having opened it, she sees a babe weeping in the ark. And the daughter of Pharaoh had compassion on it and said, this is of the Hebrews' children. And his sister said to the daughter of Pharaoh, will you that I call to you a nurse of the Hebrews, and shall she suckle the child for you? And the daughter of Pharaoh said, go. And the young woman went and called the mother of the child. And the daughter of Pharaoh said to her, take care of this child and suckled it for me, and I will give you the wages. And the woman took the child and suckled it. Now, I want you to see the providence of our Creator, and everything happens according to His will. Everyone gets according to what they deserve. Okay, these are not things that we like to keep in mind. But of all the families of the Hebrews in the land there, if you remember, the ones that never mixed with the Egyptians left. And that was what we saw, and you can follow along in the account of the ancient history of Caledonia. So the righteous remnant left before their children were taken. They did not suffer anything of that nature. Here we have another one of all the people who were left. There's no one's ever attributed fault to Amram or Kohath or the sons of Louis for anything they were doing there. As far as we know, they steadfastly stayed true, and it was through them that deliverance came because of that. But you can see that while you're staying true to your Maker, no matter the circumstances, He'll keep you safe and your children. And here's an example with Moshe. If He wanted to save every child, it could have been. Now, that's not to say that he allows these things, because He's righteous in everything. Everything that's happened is to foreshadow things that happen in the truth. If you recall, the firstborn opening the womb are His. So all of these children are His, and they will be part of the barren woman having more children at the resurrection than the one that was full of children now. It's a type of these things that we're talking about. But the the idea that people had to have suffering, it was for the things they did. They kill His firstborn, and the things they're doing, their firstborn is taken, because we reap what we sow. And if you can follow along, you can see that that is not witnessed of by this family. And because of that, they did not suffer the same thing. So I'm pointing out these things to you. It should be like a smelling salt, shocking, but it should get us to seriously consider the truth in His words, right? We can really rely on it to be, He's going to be trustworthy even when we're not, is what Scripture says. It says, and when the boy was grown, sorry, yeah. And when the boy was grown, she brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh, and he became her son. And she called his name Moshe, or Moses, saying, I took him out of the water. And that's the one drawn out, right? Moshe. But his name before, as we saw in the testaments, or in the visions of Amram, was Melech Yahu, messenger Yahuah, or the messenger of Yahuah. And he is like the one coming, who was drawn out of the waters, who is the messenger Yahuah. So very same name given to Moshe that's made that we wouldn't know of if we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Another thing of the truth being resurrected, right? And it came to pass in that length of time that Moshe, having grown, went out to his brethren, the sons of Yisrael, or Yisrael, and having noticed their distress, he sees a Mitzrayite smiting a certain Hebrew of his brethren, the children of Yisrael. And having looked round this way and that way, he sees no one, and he smote the Mitzrayite and hid him in the sand. And having gone out the second day, he sees two Hebrew men fighting. And he says to the injurer, "Wherefore smite you your neighbor?" And he said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Will you slay me as you yesterday slew the Egyptian?" Then Moshe was alarmed and said, "If thus this matter has become known." And Pharaoh heard this matter and sought to slay Moshe. Now, we don't get all the context here, although Stephen mentions that Moshe, before he was even a foreteller and a deliverer of the people, he was mighty in words and deeds. But you don't see any of that right here. Although it also mentions that he was married to an Ethiopian, but you don't see anywhere where that happened. That's part of the phenomenon where there's just text, there's things that are missing. In Josephus's writings, you have the information that the Egyptians and the magicians knew that he would be the one that delivered the people, but they wouldn't openly attack him because he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter, adopted or whatever, but that was still the issue. So they contrived to have him killed in different ways, and one of them was by sending him out as the general of the armies of Egypt to go fight their war, where he was successful in delivering a city of the Ethiopians to them by marrying the daughter of it and having her open the gates to capture it. So that's the mightiness in words and deeds and other things that he had that you don't find elsewhere, but it is alluded to. Um, However, he had already had known about him being the deliverer, so as soon as he had a pretext, he sought to slay him, right? And you remember, this is the Pharaoh that was a Canaanite that wanted to stop the promises at the behest of his master Satan. It says, "And Moshe departed from the presence of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and having come into the land of Midian, he sat on a well. And the Kohen, or priest of Midian, had 7 daughters feeding the flock of their father Jethro. And they came and drew water until they filled their pitchers to water the flock of their father Jethro. And the shepherds came and were driving them away. And Moshe rose up and rescued them and drew the water for them and watered their sheep. And they came to Raguel." Um, this was like the friend of El, or the one seeing El. And Jethro has a different meaning that I can't remember, but it's both talking about his father-in-law. And they came to Raguel, their father, and he said to them, the reason why this has a G, sorry, and this one has a U is because it's the letter ayin, which is sometimes a guttural. It makes an O or a U sound in the vowels on occasion, right? You have both Gomorrah and ayin as that same letter. It just depends on the context whether it's a G or not. This says, "And they came to Raguel, their father, and he said to them, Why have you come so quickly today? And they said, a Mitzrayite, an Egyptian, delivered us from the shepherds, and drew water for us, and watered our sheep. And he said to his daughters, And where is he, and why have you left the man? Call him therefore, that he may eat bread. And Moshe was established with the man, and he gave Zipporah or Sephirah, his daughter, to Moshe to wife. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and Moshe called his name Gershom or Gresham, which is sojourner, right? Saying, I am a sojourner in a strange land, which was the same thing that his forefather Louis had done with his firstborn. And he foretold that his children would be sojourners in the land in which they dwell. That is still true to this day, right? They never had an inheritance in it. It says, and in those days, after a length of time, the king of Mitzrayim died, and the children of Israel groaned because of their tasks, and cried, and their cry because of their tasks went up to Elohim. And Elohim heard their groanings, and Elohim remembered his covenant made with Abraham and Yitzhak and Jacob. And Elohim looked upon the children of Israel and was made known to them. So it says, and was made known to them. That's a little bit different than what you can see Elohim had respect unto, right? This one is literally yada, he will know, and then them. So could have been the same thing, and it makes more sense in this context because that's exactly what happened. He, when he calls Moshe, as we'll see, he says, I've heard, and I'm sending you so that you can make me known to them, to tell them, right? As we'll see right here. If at any time you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to ask. If you don't want to say it out loud, you can put it in the chat. No problem, okay? But we're going to continue with chapter 3. It says, and Moshe was feeding the flock of Jethro. Now remember, I don't mean to keep cutting in all the time, but I just want continuity's sake. 91 years or so before the captivity or the closing off of the border. By the time Amram's passing away in his testament, Moshe's 17, Aharon is 20, and Miriam is 30 years old, where she had already been married to his youngest brother, I believe? But Uziel, if I remember correctly. Either way, this was when Moshe was 17, and now this is 40 when he was after he was 40, it was when he went into when he went to Midian, excuse me. And then he spent another 40 years over there. And he didn't come back until he was 80 years old. Excuse me. So you have a total of 215 years while the children are in the land there, but not while they're in captivity. That's the point. And within that 215 years, they went from 70 beings to over 2 million, however, 600,000 fighting men plus the women and children. That's not to mention the groups that had left previously to that, right? A multitude in the world. He makes them very prolific. And that's nothing to be surprised about. In some of the books that you can still find online that talk about the birthright covenants of Yahush's children in Britain and America, they go into the details of the proliferation of children being one of the benefits or blessings of that birthright. And then they talk about the actual before our countries were doing things that are not lawful according to his word with our children before they're born and being encouraged with that kind of thing. They were doubling their populations every 20 years, every 25 years or less. That's a massive amount of growth. But if it's possible for us, then it was possible for the children back here as well. And they've had videos where geneticists have done the math, the computations, and they've found that it's completely within reason, both with the 400-year span or the 215, because they did it with both. I'll actually share that video if you guys aren't familiar. I'll put it in the description of this one as well for anyone that would like to check that out, just for more confirmation of the things that we've mentioned, 215 years, not 400, and the facts that these things are legitimate and true, that it's entirely within reason that you can have so many people come from so few. But we'll go ahead and continue. It says, and Moshe was feeding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the Kohen of Midian, and he brought the sheep nigh to the wilderness and came to the mount of Horeb. And the messenger Yahuah, it says an angel of Yahuah, right? But it's the Melech Yahuah. This is the word of is supplied. It's not actually in the Hebrew text. And sometimes the content, you can have it. There is a way of putting that with the vowel points or otherwise where you can have the context of in the words themselves. And I don't know if there's any time it's ever done when it's using the words messenger of Yahuwah. I don't know if it ever was done. Sometimes the context is it's literally angels or other messengers, if you will. But other times the context is literally the messenger who is called Yahuwah, the one who said, my name is in him. He will by no means leave you unpunished for your iniquities, right? That one who you have to listen to that's leading over his people is our Mashiach pre-incarnate. This is clearly talked about in the Apostolic Constitutions, Irenaeus, and other writings of the renewed covenant times. And it's things that you can infer and see through here if you just use right reason. As no man has ever seen or heard the Father, here we have a being who's the messenger that professes to be the Elohim of Yaakov, who's the one that is um, later on as a man bowed down to and worshipped by Yahushua, the son of Nun, right? And the man that Abraham saw was called Yahuah as well. So this is just another example of that. And these things are clearly explained in the renewed covenant writings. They are it completely made known where you don't have to just infer it, but you actually have to know those writings and read them to see that. And that would be the 5 books of Against Heresies by Irenaeus, the Apostolic Constitutions, the recognitions of Clement, the epistles that they have in the what they call the ante-Nicene writings. Not all of them are legitimate, but the ones that are rather amazing, and it's really worth looking at. So it says, and the messenger Yahuwah appeared to him in flaming fire out of the bush, and he sees that the bush burns with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And Moshe said, I will go near and see this great sight, why the bush is not consumed. And when Yahuwah saw that he drew nigh to see, Yahuwah called him out of the bush, saying, Moshe, Moshe. And he said, what is it? Now you see, it doesn't say when the messenger, it's directly saying Yahuwah, right? In the book of Yobelim, the messenger of the presence, who's speaking to Moshe on top of the mount, mentions that the Father was speaking through him on occasion. And I believe that was also our pre-incarnate, if you will, Mashiach. There's other instances where he appears to different foretellers at different times, but he's not always the messenger that appears to them. Another example of that is in the book of Daniel. You have at one time just a regular angel, if you will, or messenger. If you don't know, angel is Greek for messenger. It's the same word. It just people don't always make that connection. And if you are familiar, it's not always a spiritual being that is a messenger. All of his wonders that he created are literally means of his messengers or the place of his messengers. Everything that he's created, everything that exists is to teach a reasonable mind the truth, or it's a message. to the mind of a man. But that's for a different thing. So the point is, this messenger, sometimes they're regular spirits there that are servants to him, ministering messengers, as is mentioned in the book of Hebrews. And then sometimes it's actually our Mashiach that talks to them. You can find that example in the book of Daniel, where he doesn't go out and directly say, I'm the Mashiach there. But you can see that it's him, because when he speaks, the very thing that he says is what exactly happens, just like our Mashiach does all throughout the entire renewed covenant. The same thing happens in the book of Ezekiel, for example, when he says, when he speaks, and then the Ruach goes out and takes him and brings him where he needs to go. The Ruach does the thing that he says. It's telling you without saying it who's the one doing that, right? But those are things that a reasonable mind has to see and and learn from. It's something that our Creator will show you as you go through the scriptures, Father willing. So it says right here, verse 4, and when Yahuah saw that he drew nigh to see, Yahuah called him out of the bush, saying, Moshe, Moshe. And he said, what is it? And he said, draw not nigh hither, or do not come near. Loose the sandals, or your sandals, from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is set apart ground. And he said, I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, and the Elohim of Yitzhak, and the Elohim of Jacob. And Moshe turned away his face, for he was afraid to gaze at Elohim, not at a messenger, right? Or not just any old messenger. And Yahuah said to Moshe, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, that is in Mitzrayim, and I have heard their cry by their taskmasters, for I know their affliction. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Mitzrayites, or the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land, and bring them into a tove and wide land, into a land flowing with milk and honey, into the place of the Canaanim, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Pezerites, and Girgashites, and Hivites, and Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come to me, and I have seen the affliction with which the Mitzrayites afflict them. And now come, I will send you to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, or Mitzrayim. I'm sorry, I don't really say that as well as I would like to. A phenomenon in the Hebrew, which was dropped in the English, but was still carried over in Germanic to some extent, and is definitely still seen in the Spanish and in the Celtic, is where they roll the R. It's not something that I'm very good at myself, but it's a phenomenon that they did whenever it was within the letter. And it's not something that even in the modern Hebrew, if you take Bill Berg's 501 or 503 Hebrew grammar, they'll talk about that phenomenon when they do the doubling Dagesh for things. You don't normally double the R, but that's because it was rolled, so it kind of doubled anyways. But anyways, this is the king of Mitzrayim, and you shall bring out my people, the children of Yisrael, or Yisrael, right, from the land of Mitzrayim. And Moshe said to Elohim, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that I should bring out the children of Yisrael, or Yisrael, from the land of Mitzrayim? And Elohim spoke to Moshe, saying, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that I shall send you forth. When you bring out my people out of Mitzrayim, then you shall serve Elohim in this mountain. So I don't know if you got that, but the sign was that after everything I said is done and it's said and done, you're going to be right here worshiping me. That's your sign that the very thing I told you to do is going to happen. not not so much of a reassuring thing for him, but in the course of what he's doing, he's going to see over and over again the power of our Creator, and he's going to have no qualms with that. And Moshe said to Elohim, Behold, I shall go forth to the children of Yisrael, and shall say to them, The Elohim of our fathers has sent me to you. And they will ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And Elohim spoke to Moshe, saying, I am the being. And he said, Thus shall you say to the children of Yisrael, The being has sent me to you. Or literally, I am that I am. The word there is ahia, right? You have an aleph before that, haya, and then you have asher, which is that, who, which, what. It's a direct from one thing to another. And then ahia, the same thing. You have the aleph before the hey, yod, hey there, which is I am or I will. So I am or I exist, which is exactly that I exist, or the I am. And if you recall, our Mashiach all over the renewed covenant said I am to them, including right when they said, when he says, Who do you seek? Yahushua ha-Nazari. And he said to them, I am, and they stumbled backwards and fell, right? So this is the one that was speaking before Abraham came to be, Ahia, right? I am. And that's when they tried to stone him, if you recall. Although, admittingly, the words in Hebrew here do not always line up with the word for I am in other places, because this is Ahia, and you can say I am as Ani, Aleph Nun Yod, which is quite often how it's translated I am in other places. Whether or not he really said this or that, this is what he was alluding to. This is what they were trying to stone him for. Not just saying he was, but that he was the I am that predated Abraham. And Elohim said again to Moshe, Thus shall you say to the sons of Yisrael, Yahuah Elohim of our fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzhak, and the Elohim of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my Shem Zakorka, right? Or Zakar, Shem Zakar, his memorial name, as they call it. And my memorial to generations of generations, never to be forgotten, right? He will cause his name to be recalled in all generations, it mentions in the Psalms. And our Mashiach himself said, I have made your name known, and I shall make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me might be in them, and I in them, directly correlating his name with the truth and everything that is right. Just something to keep in mind there. But go then and gather the elders of the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, Yahuah Elohim of our fathers has appeared to me, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzhak, and the Elohim of Jacob, saying, I have surely looked upon you, and upon all the things which have happened to you in Mitzrayim. And he said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of the Mitzrayites, to the land of the Canaanim, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Pezerites, and the Girgashites, and the Hivites, and Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And they shall hearken to your voice, and you and the elders of Yisrael shall go in to Pharaoh, the king of Mitzrayim, and you shall say to him, The Elohim of the Hebrews has called us. We will go on a journey of 3 days into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to our Elohim. But I know that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, will not let you go, save with a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand and smite the Mitzrayites with all my wonders. The word for wonder, I've told you, the palmoni is a title that's in the book of Daniel and the Apostolic Constitutions about the wonderful numberer. And that word for like paleo is palar here. It's the word where we get for wonder. Well, it's the root for it, and it's changed in English, but that, I believe that's where the word paleo comes from. It's the wonder, however. There's other wonders in his creation, or I'm sorry, his works. That word for the works that he's done is that word that is the means or the place of messengers. And that's where his works, the things that he's created, are telling a message. So I'm sorry about that. I might have mixed that up. But his wonders there are like his pala, or where we say paleo. It says, "But I know Pharaoh, king of Egypt, will not let you go save with a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand and smite the Mitzrayites with all my wonders, which I shall work among them. And after that he will send you forth. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And whenever you shall escape, you shall not depart empty," which was foreshadowed in their forefather Abraham after he went into Mitzrayim, or Egypt, because of a famine. He was afflicted by Pharaoh when his wife was taken, and Pharaoh's house was plagued until his wife was restored to him, and uh, he became rich through the booty that was given when he was told and asked to depart. That was a foreshadow of what the children would do later on that we can see right here as well. He's not plundering them because he likes to hurt people, but if you recall, they enslaved a people who were free and made them work for naught. And this was reprimanding, or this was reparations for that offense. This is why he calls Egypt one of his later on, along with Assyria, because he's actually corrected them for the things they've done, right? It says, "But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and fellow lodger articles of gold and silver and apparel, and you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and spoil you the Mitzrayites, or Egyptians." All right, and then we're on chapter 4 here. Excuse me. It says, "And Moshe answered and said, If you, or if they believe me not, and do not hearken to my voice, for they will say, Elohim has not appeared to you, what shall I say to them? And Yahuah said to him, What is this thing that is in your hand? And he said, A rod. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moshe fled from it. And Yahuah said to Moshe, Stretch forth your hand and take hold of its tail. So he stretched forth his hand and took hold of the tail, which I don't know if any of you are familiar, but that's contrary to snake handling practices. If you have a poisonous snake, you would go for its head if you were going to try to catch it. It says, "And it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe you, that Yahuah, or that the Elohim of your fathers has appeared to you, the Elohim of Abraham, and Elohim of Yitzhak, and Elohim of Jacob." And Yahuah said again to him, Put your hand into your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and brought his hand out of his bosom, and his hand became as snow. And he said again, Put your hand into your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and brought his hand out of his bosom, and it was again restored to the complexion of his of his flesh. It says, If they will not believe you, nor hearken to the voice of the first sign, they will believe you, or they will believe you because of the voice of the second sign. Now, I can't recall the significance or the spiritual fulfillment or significance of this first one with the serpent. Um, when I'm thinking about it, what comes to mind is completely different, but I'll talk about that later. However, there is an explanation for what that was foretelling by in Irenaeus' Against Heresies, I believe. It's also mentioned by him about this second one, which putting his right hand in his bosom and having it come out leprous was as our Mashiach appeared in the first times, where he was considered unclean by the people. And then when he put it back and came out with his hand restored as the other, it's when he returns again. Yeah, Mashiach said, if you do not believe me because of these words, believe me because of the signs which the Father has given me to do. Exactly. It was trying to appeal to the signs as evidence for what he was saying to be legitimate. It wasn't appealing to him. We don't have to believe him just because of what he's saying. You never have to appeal to a man for anything, but to the manifest power of the Almighty saying he's not lying, right? However, this was also foretelling the first and second advents of our Mashiach, the right hand of the Father, who would come dishonorably the first time, then fully restored the second. They would know who he is. And right, that was the picture in that one. And then it says, and it shall come to pass, if they will not believe you for these two signs, and will not hearken to your voice, that you shall take of the water of the river, and pour it upon the dry land. And the water which you shall take from the river shall be blood upon the dry land. And Moshe said to Yahuah, I pray Yahuah, and remember, that's if they're unbelievers of the first and second sign. So then it's blood on the dry land that was water. Another sign that we have with the blood waters with the Mitzraites for what they chose to do. And then later on in the book of Revelation, you have the waters turning like blood, what we call red tides, that have been prevalent the world over for our keeping of the Christ Mass and other pagan things directly contrary to his word. And that's expounded on in great detail in the Antichrist for Dummies video series, where he goes through the book of Revelation and shows the proper translations of the words, the actual signs that you can see in the heavens and when they took place, and the fulfillments of these things in history, or their soon to be fulfillment, which, if anyone's following along, we're right now in his saucer judgments being poured out because we're not doing what he said. Another example, we're like the children after they came back from the captivity, after the Reformation, who had the truth and had now gone apostate again, right? Just for continuity for what happened with those timelines. And Moshe said to Yahuah, I pray Yahuah, I have not been sufficient in former times, neither from the time that you have begun to speak to your servant. I am weak in speech and slow-tongued. This could be because he grew up part of his life in the Egyptian courts and he's not as fluent with the Hebrew as everyone else was. It could be for some other reason. We don't have the detail. The point is, he's saying that he hasn't been sufficient trying to help his people. He had to flee the country, if you recall, and he doesn't think he's going to be that way now. Let him have someone to help him, right? That was the whole point here. He may have had information, if you remember what we read from the visions of Amram, where his father foretold to Moshe and Aharon what would be in store for them both. We don't have all of it, it was just fragments. But this could have been in line with him asking because of that, or something else that he knew. It could have been because he was timid. We don't know everything that was going on, just what is actually written. But my point is, when we read this, we shouldn't postulate and just add things or make stuff up for what we think it should mean. We got to just keep it for what it actually says. That very phenomenon is what happened with the 120 years example in Genesis, where it says, my ruach will not always abide with man, but their years shall be 120. And then you have the account of the flood, because it doesn't mention that that was said in the 480th year of Noah's life, and then in the 600 the rains came. That's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls explicitly. Individuals have taken that 120 years and they've come up with a whole bunch of different ideas about what that means. 120 jubilees for all of the totality of history or some other things. And all of that is adding to the plain text, and it changes the meaning of what is actually written elsewhere plainly. So I'm never an advocate of doing that. If you ever catch me doing it, try to ask where something comes from to see. And if I can't show you, that's something that I have to be corrected from, right? Because we don't want to agree or go along with things that we can't prove right out of his word. And Yahuah said to Moshe, who has given man, or given a mouth to man, and who has made the very hard of hearing, and the deaf, and the seeing, and the blind? Have not I Elohim? And now go, and I will open your mouth, and will instruct you in what you shall say. So who's the one that helps people to comprehend or not, right? Who gives people the ability to hear and see and or not? Now, if he gives it to them physically, what about spiritually? If he can take away our ability to physically see, can he take away our ability to spiritually comprehend the truth? Absolutely. Who's responsible for that, right? Who puts wisdom into the inner heart of a man? Who do we ask for intelligence, wisdom, comprehension? That's the point. These things are not endowed in every man just because it's our nature. It's a gift, and it can change too. He says, now go, and I will open your mouth and will instruct you in what you shall say. And Moshe said, I pray you, Yahuah, appoint another able person, or another able whom you shall send. And Yahuah was greatly angered against Moshe, and said, behold, is not Aharon, the Lui, your brother? I know that he will surely speak to you, and behold, he will come forth to meet you, and beholding you, he will rejoice within himself. And you shall speak to him, and you shall put my words into his mouth. If you remember, our Mashiach says, I only say what I hear, I only do what I see. And I've talked about that before. It's like a hand in a glove, hand in a glove, or as Kepha describes, as the substance of a man produces a shadow, so much more the existence of the Father produced our Mashiach, right? He's the one that effectively does the will of the Father in creation, does not deviate from it. So as he was sent to do, so he sends to do. A type in glove, a picture in a picture. And you can see that very clearly right here. It says, and you shall speak to him, and you shall put my words into his mouth, and I will open your mouth and his mouth, and I will instruct you in what you shall do. And he shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be for him in things pertaining to Elohim. But this says, and you shall be to him instead of Elohim, right? This one says, in other versions, says, and you shall be to him un Elohim. Be an Elohim to Aharon, and he shall be your foreteller, right? That's the type. Just like our Mashiach was sent from the Father to be an Elohim, okay? And Moshe was going to be his foreteller. So there's a picture there. And this rod that was turned into a serpent you shall take in your hand, wherewith you shall work miracles. And Moshe went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and says, I will go and return to my brethren in Mitzrayim, and will see if they are yet living. And Jethro said to Moshe, go in health. And in those days, after some time, the king of Mitzrayim died. And Yahuah said to Moshe, in Midian, go, depart into Mitzrayim, for all that sought your life are dead. Now, here's that inverse there, how he had to leave Mitzrayim and come back, right? Our Mashiach had to leave the land and then come back, but he went into Mitzrayim to hide from the persecution until the ones that sought his life were dead, right? This is kind of inverted. And you find a lot of those examples throughout. We've talked about them before. Another one is Dawid dying on the Sabbath, where our Mashiach resurrected on it, right? um, where it was all the brothers that sold their Yahusuf, and then it was only one that betrayed him. So there's a picture there. And it wasn't literally all, if you remember, Zebulun was still young and he wasn't really in agreement with him. Benjamin was a child and didn't have any say in the matter. But you get the context there. There's a lot of things that are inverted. It's not exactly how it will play out later on, but the theme, the type is there. And quite often there's an inversion. Usually I'll find that it's like the menorah. Before he came, it will be one way. After he came, it would be another. And the inversion happens with his advent, if you will. A great example of that is the times of the Maccabees. You had king priests who were approved by our Creator, who were working righteousness and doing the will of the people, liberating them and freeing them from paganism. And then after his times, it was the inverse. Those king priests were Nicolaitan pagans that were usurping things and doing things in an unlawful manner. But it was still the king priest type that was being shown both ways. We'll go ahead and continue. It says, and Moshe took his wife and his children and mounted them on the beasts and returned to Mitzrayim. And Moshe took the rod from Elohim in his hand. And Yahuah said to Moshe, when you go and return to Mitzrayim, see all the miracles I have charged you with. You shall work before Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart, and he shall certainly not send away the people. The people, right? Ha'am in Hebrew, but that's the word. The Laos is the Greek form that later became an Asian Buddhist people, but that was the type of the people. Deutsch, Dutch land, right? Germany, but Deutsch, that means of the people, literally. The laity of the people. These are all different titles that mean the exact same thing, all pointing to who these people are. And we are the people. In America and Britain, it's always about the people and our constitution and form of government, directly correlating to these things. Because if you remember, what's in scripture foretells the future, the things that literally are. We've gone over that before. Even the word for Buddhists was the Budai, or the exiled at that time. It's mentioned and foretold in Amos. The Roundheads, the Lollards, we've gone over at Columbia, the woman in the wilderness. These things are what was spoken of, that you can see the literal words in the text that are fulfilled in history. This is just another example of that one, but we are the people of Elohim and have been for a long time, everywhere that we've gone. Whether we've rejected the truth or not, that was still what they were known for, and you can see the evidence of it in different places. And for anyone who has no idea what I was just saying, and that's all over your head, I'm terribly sorry. We've talked about these things quite a few occasions. There's many books that we've mentioned. The ones that talk about the Buddhists in particular is the Saxons of the East and of the West, or it's called The Lost Tribes and the Saxons of the East and of the West. And that's a wonderful book. If you want to know about the fulfillment of the woman in the wilderness, Columbia, the Roundheads, and how that was foretold in the names of things there, and the Lollards and the examples of those words and the actual fulfillment in history for what people were called as examples, you can see that throughout the Antichrist for Dummies videos over and over again. It was one of the things that helped me to start seeing that picture. And then you can see evidence of it in the books from the 1800s where men were writing about the history of the people and what they were called and things like that. Although those connections were not so clearly made in every reference. It's a little bit here and a little bit there that it was pieced together. But back on track here. It says, in Moshe, all right, I read that one. We're on verse 22. It says, and you shall say to Pharaoh, these things says Yahuah, Yisrael, my firstborn. Right? Israel is my firstborn. That's quoted as speaking of our Mashiach. And this is where you find the first reference, an allusion to him as titled by that name. You can literally see it throughout the foretellers and the Old Testament or original covenant writings, if you will. If you look at the Hebrew, it will say all over the place, Kadosh Yisrael. And it mentions that this is Yahuah of hosts and other things. They translate it as the set apart one of Israel. And those words are added. There's no word for one. All of that stuff is superfluous to what the text is plainly saying. Kadosh Yisrael. He is the set apart or distinguished one who strove with men and Elohim and overcame. He is the perfect man or example for us, the true optimum of what we ought to be. And that's why he's called the Kadosh Israel. Right. And if you can look at that title for yourselves, we can go over that sometime if you want. It's pretty amazing just digging into that by on its own. But that's where he says, Yisrael is my firstborn. And you can see he's the one who's the king over the people and also called Yahuah and given all these things in the covenants there. But that's also something that's hidden in the text because Satan is the enemy of our inner beings, right? He says, and I said to you, send away my people that they may serve me. Now, if you will not send them away, see, I will slay your firstborn son. And it came to pass, the messenger of Yahuah met him, and the messenger is also said to be Satan that met him on the way. You find more details about this in the book of Yobelim. But just for context here, because the Masoretic doesn't go into so much detail about what's going on, Satan sought to have Moshe killed because his children were not circumcised according to the law. And he was going to bring them in to be ruling over the people and being the lawgiver, having something unlawful couldn't stand. They had to have them circumcised before they could do so. And that's the events that were going on here, but you don't really see that too clearly in context. It says, and it came to be, the messenger of Yahuah met him by the way in the inn and sought to slay him. And Zipporah, having taken a stone, cut off the foreskin of her son, and fell at his feet and said, the blood of the circumcision of my son is staunched. Now, in the other one, it says, yeah, surely you're a husband of blood to me, right? This blood of the circumcision be on you, or something to that effect, right? But we'll go ahead and read it here. And he departed from him because she said, the blood of the circumcision of my son is staunched. And Yahuah said to Aharon, or Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moshe. And he went and met him in the mount of Elohim, and they kissed each other. And Moshe reported to Aharon all the words of Yahuah, which he sent, and all the things which he charged him. And Moshe and Aharon went and gathered the elders of the children of Israel, and Aharon spoke all these words, which Elohim spoke to Moshe, and wrought the miracles before the people. And the people believed and rejoiced because Elohim visited the children of Israel, and because he saw their affliction. And the people bowed and worshiped. All right, just give me one moment. All right, so we're going to get into chapter 5 next week, where Moshe is actually going to confront Pharaoh for the first time and all the interactions between them and the wonders that happen, the miracles that our Creator manifests through Moshe, the one drawn out of the waters, who's the messenger Yahuah or of Yahuah, who's like unto the one coming. This is the whole point, right? Um, he is performing these through him to deliver his people from the bondage that, if you guys are paying attention, they've rightly suffered for the things they've done, because everyone gets according to what we deserve. Now, that will become more apparent as we go along, especially after they're delivered and he gives them the covenant and he reads the Torah to them. It's not just the 10 Commandments, but he also said, and I'm going to speak to you, Moshe, to give them my right rulings. If you go through all of that, chapters up to 23, right? That is the common law or the covenant that's beholden to everyone. It's what's it's what's still in continuance when the added bonds were done away with, right? Although there are some things that are not mentioned in there that are still applicable, like the festivals, the feast days, which he says are forever. His dietary laws are still applicable for his children because they were never abrogated, even after the fact you have in the book of Acts where Kepha says, I've never done that. And he wasn't rebuked for not eating unclean meat. He was corrected for calling men or things that were cleansed by our Creator unclean, which he was being enjoined not to do, of which he freely said, right? So we know these things, but it's not always clearly written out. You have to look at the apostolic constitutions and in particular the heresy section, where it goes into the nuances of what happened, where you get a real comprehensive understanding of the cause and effect of what we're going to be reading through, what the children chose to do with the truth given to them, and then all the consequences that have happened since then. So we'll get into that beginning next week, including the differences between what we have here in the Septuagint slash Masoretic versions and compared to the Samaritan and Dead Sea Scrolls. So, Father willing, that'll be an eye opener. As you can see, there's bits, pieces missing for a variety of reasons, but we'll get into that next week. Until then, you have a wonderful Shabbat, a great week ahead, and we will see you next time. Shalom.